This 1863 photo of two women seems elegant at first, but historians later discovered their real story. Dr. Rebecca Torres had spent 15 years studying Civil War photographs, yet nothing had prepared her for this discovery. On a calm Tuesday morning in March 2019, the archives of the Charleston Historical Society felt dim and quiet, with the smell of old paper and preserving chemicals in the air. She sat at a simple wooden table, slowly turning the pages of a leather-bound catalog marked Southern Portraits, 1860-1865. The photograph showed up on page 47. Two women sat side by side in a fancy photography studio. Both wore beautiful silk dresses with detailed lace collars. Their hair was pinned up neatly in the style of the 1860s. The picture was in very good condition. The details looked clear, even after so many years. The catalog simply said, "Two Ladies of Charleston, 1863. Unknown subjects." Rebecca adjusted her magnifying glass and leaned in closer. Something about the picture felt off to her, a small detail she could not quite explain. The woman on the left sat with her hands neatly folded in her lap, her back straight, chin raised a little. The woman on the right had a similar pose, but her eyes and the slight tension in her shoulders seemed different in a subtle way. Rebecca took a photo of the image with her digital camera, then kept looking through the catalog. Still, her thoughts kept going back to that one photograph. During lunch, she opened the image on her laptop and zoomed in on different parts. That was when she noticed it. On the right woman's wrist, almost hidden under the lace edge of her sleeve, was a thin, dark line. Rebecca zoomed in more. It was not a shadow or a mark from the photo process. It looked like a scar or something similar. Her heart started beating quicker. She looked closely at their hands. The left woman's hands appeared smooth and unmarked. The right woman's hands, even with the elegant gloves, showed rough calluses at the base of her fingers, visible when examined carefully through the fabric. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. In 1863, in Charleston during the Confederacy, who would take a formal photo of two women sitting together as equals? And why did one show signs of hard work while dressed like a lady? She opened her notebook and wrote one question. Who were they really? The search that took over the next 8 months of her life had started. Rebecca went back to the archives the next morning with fresh energy. She asked for all records about photography studios in Charleston from 1860 to 1865. The archivist, an older man named Mr. Harrison, raised his eyebrows but brought 3 boxes of papers. "Searching for something particular, Dr. Torres?" he asked while placing the boxes on her table. "This photograph," she replied, showing him the image on her laptop. "Do you know the studio backdrop?" Mr. Harrison looked at the screen, then nodded slowly. "That's Whitmore's studio. See the painted column and the velvet curtain? Jonathan Whitmore had his place on King Street. He was known for taking pictures of rich families." Rebecca spent the whole day going through Whitmore's business records. The old ledgers were delicate, with yellowed and brittle pages. She found listings for many photographs. Families, soldiers leaving for war, couples on their wedding days. Each entry had a date, names of the people, and the amount paid. Then, on a page dated September 14th, 1863, she found something that made her stop breathing for a moment. 2 subjects, private sitting, payment received in advance. No names listed, as requested by the client. Rebecca took a picture of the page. A private sitting without names was very unusual back then. Photographers usually wrote down names for their records and future prints. She looked up more about Whitmore. Born in Boston in 1822, he moved to Charleston in 1855 and started his studio. But one thing stood out. A newspaper article from 1866, after the war, said Whitmore had spoken in a local court case, and the reporter mentioned he had quiet abolitionist views, though he kept them hidden during the war. An abolitionist photographer living in Confederate Charleston. Rebecca felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together. She checked the date, September 14th, 1863, against other historical events. The siege of Charleston had grown worse that summer. Union forces were getting closer. Why would two women take the risk of a photography session in such dangerous times? And why insist on no names? Rebecca shut her laptop as the archives closed for the day. Outside, the historic streets of Charleston looked warm in the golden evening light. She walked past beautiful old homes with their wide porches and iron details, wondering about the secrets those streets had seen. Tomorrow she would start looking at property records and plantation lists. She'd believed the names of the two women were somewhere in those papers. Rebecca's next step took her to the Charleston County property records. She focused on homes near Whitmore's studio that had enough money for such a formal photo. The list turned out to be short. By 1863, many rich families had left Charleston because of the growing danger. One name kept appearing: the Ashford household. They owned a rice plantation about 15 miles outside the city, but kept a townhouse on Meeting Street, only a few blocks from Whitmore's studio. Rebecca asked for estate papers on the Ashford family. What came was a thick folder with wills, property transfers, and best of all, a household inventory from 1864. It listed the family: Richard Ashford, age 52, plantation owner. His wife had died in 1859. His daughter, Elizabeth Ashford, age 28, unmarried, ran the household. The papers also named 37 enslaved people by first name only, with their ages and jobs. One line stood out: Sarah, age 26, house servant, lady's maid. Rebecca's heart beat faster. Two women of similar age, one the owner's daughter, the other her personal maid. She went back to the photograph, looking at their faces with new eyes. She found more papers. Letters from Elizabeth to a cousin in Virginia, saved in a family collection given to the Historical Society years ago. The letters sounded polite, talking about weather and visits. But one from August 1863 had a strange part: the weight of what I know grows heavier each day. Father's wrongs are not mine, yet I carry their results. I have made a choice that would shock our society, but my conscience will not allow anything else. What choice? What wrongs? Rebecca found Richard Ashford's will from 1857. Among the property there was an odd note: upon my death, the girl Sarah is to receive special consideration in her placement or sale, as her situation needs particular care. The words felt strange. Special consideration and situation hinted at something more than a normal master-slave tie. Rebecca looked deeper into Richard Ashford's past. She found his marriage record from 1834 and Elizabeth's birth record from 1835, but she also found earlier papers from 1831, showing Richard bought a woman named Hannah, age 19, listed as mulatto, house-trained, literate. Hannah. Rebecca checked the 1864 inventory again. Number Hannah. Burial records gave the answer. Hannah died in 1847 from fever, but in property records from the same year, a birth was noted on the Ashford plantation. A girl named Sarah, born to Hannah in January 1837. Rebecca did the math. Sarah would be 26 in 1863, matching the inventory. Born just 2 years after Elizabeth. The meaning hit hard, but Rebecca needed real proof, not just hints. Rebecca knew she needed more than records and lists. She needed Sarah's own words, something showing she was more than a name on paper. Enslaved people almost never left written traces. The system worked hard to erase their stories. She spent 3 days searching every document tied to the Ashford household. Then, in a box of papers given by a distant Ashford relative in 1923, she found a small leather journal. The writing looked tight and careful, as if the writer was afraid of being caught. The first entry was from July 1862. Miss Elizabeth gave me this book. She says I should write my thoughts, though I hardly know what to write that would not cause trouble. Rebecca's hands shook as she read on. The entries came now and then, written with caution. Sarah wrote about daily work, the weather, The sound of faraway guns as Union forces came closer, but slowly, more personal things appeared. Miss Elizabeth insists I learn with her in the evenings. She teaches me to read better and write well. Master Richard must never know. If he found his books touched by someone like me, his anger would be awful. Another entry from March 1863. She told me today, with tears, we share a father, Sarah. You are my sister, though the world will never accept it. I already felt it deep inside. I see his face in my reflection, the same as in hers. But hearing it said out loud felt like a storm. Rebecca photographed every page, her heart racing. This was the proof she needed. Elizabeth and Sarah were half-sisters, linked by their father's abuse of an enslaved woman. But the journal showed more. It told of Elizabeth's growing resolve to recognize Sarah openly, no matter the danger. She has grown careless with sorrow and guilt. Since Master Richard became sick last month, she speaks freely to me when we are alone. She says, when he dies, I will free you. I will give you money to go north. But first, I want something to remember you by, something that shows the real truth of who we are to each other. The journal's last entry was dated September 13th, 1863. One day before the secret photo session. Tomorrow we do the impossible. Miss Elizabeth arranged it with the photographer. Miss Elizabeth arranged it with the photographer. Miss Elizabeth arranged it with the photographer. Whitmore. He supports our cause. We will sit together dressed as equals and have our portrait taken. She says, let there be one true picture of us, Sarah, one moment where the world's lies cannot reach us. I feel scared and excited at the same time. Rebecca sat back, moved by the bravery and pain in those words. Rebecca needed to know the full danger Elizabeth and Sarah faced. She reached out to Dr. Marcus Williams, an expert on Civil War social rules and laws. They met at a coffee shop near the university. Marcus looked at the image, then met her eyes seriously. Do you realize what would have happened if anyone found out? I'm starting to, Rebecca answered. In 1863 Charleston, Marcus said, what Elizabeth did was social ruin at best, and possibly a crime. South Carolina's slave laws clearly banned treating enslaved people as equals. The rules demanded that slaves show respect always, walk behind white people, avoid eye contact, and never sit beside them like equals. He pointed to the photo. This picture breaks every social and legal rule of Confederate life. If caught, Sarah could be whipped or sold far away for disrespect. Elizabeth would be completely cut off from society. Her property might be taken by relatives saying she was not fit to manage it. And the photographer, Rebecca asked, Whitmore could be arrested for helping rebellion. Even suspected abolitionist views were risky. People got tarred and feathered for less. Rebecca showed him the journal entry about the sitting. Marcus read it carefully, then shook his head in wonder. This was not just a portrait, he said softly. It was an act of defiance. Elizabeth was making proof of Sarah's humanity, of their family bond, in a society built on denying both. Rebecca went back to the archives with fresh questions. She looked for any record of September 14th or 15, 1863, to see if the photo session had been noticed. She found a short note in Charleston police records from September 15th, a report of odd activity near King Street at a photography studio. But the officer found nothing wrong after checking. Had someone seen two women going into Whitmore's studio? Had the police come because of a tip? She also found a letter from Jonathan Whitmore to his brother in Boston, dated September 20th, 1863. I took a big risk this week, one that could ruin my business or worse. But when a young woman comes to you fully aware of the danger, asking only for one honest image of herself and her sister, a sister the law says does not exist, how can you say no? I have hidden the negative safely. Maybe one day when this madness ends, the truth in it will matter. Whitmore knew exactly what he was saving. But what happened to that negative, and how did the photo survive? Rebecca followed the timeline. after September 1863. The journal entries stopped after the photo session. Either Sarah stopped writing, or later pages were lost. She searched for what happened to the Ashford household next. Richard Ashford's death record showed he died on November 3, 1863, from heart problems and illness. His estate went to Elizabeth as his only legal heir. But in January 1864, distant Ashford cousins challenged the will in court. They said Elizabeth had been influenced too much by servants and northern ideas and could not manage the estate properly. Rebecca read the court statements. Neighbors said Elizabeth treated her house servants with too much closeness. A former overseer claimed she did not keep proper control. The cousins won. The court gave them control of the estate and removed Elizabeth. A new property list from March 1864 showed the forced sale of household items, including servants. Sarah's name was on the list. Sarah, aged 27, lady's maid, sold to a broker for auction in Montgomery, Alabama. Rebecca felt a lump in her throat. Sarah had been sold away, separated from Elizabeth, sent deeper south where her future looked even darker. But what became of Sarah? Rebecca's search for Sarah turned into something she could not stop. She checked auction records and sales lists in Montgomery, looking for any sign of a woman like Sarah. The war ended in 1865. Slavery was over, but the mess of Reconstruction left records broken and hard to find. Rebecca began to worry. She might never know Sarah's fate. Her big break came from an unexpected place. While looking into abolition networks, she found mentions of a Quaker family in Philadelphia, the Thompsons, who ran a boarding house that helped refugees and escaped enslaved people. The same place where Elizabeth had stayed. Rebecca contacted the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and asked for the Thompson family papers. The collection had letters, account books, and a diary kept by Martha Thompson from 1863 to 1867. Rebecca's hands trembled as she read the entry from November 1864. Today, a young woman of color came to our door, tired and desperate. She had escaped from Alabama and traveled for weeks through risky areas, helped by brave people on the Underground Railroad. She asked if we knew Elizabeth Ashford. When I said yes, Elizabeth had stayed with us earlier. The woman started crying with relief. She said they are sisters. Sarah had made it. She had me through terrible hardship to Philadelphia, following hints and names until she reached people who could guide her to Elizabeth. Martha Thompson's diary went on. The reunion of Elizabeth and Sarah was the deepest thing I have seen in all my years of this work. They held each other and cried for an hour. Elizabeth kept saying, "I tried to free you before they took you. I failed you." Sarah answered, "You freed me in every way that counted long before I left that place." Rebecca learned that Martha Thompson helped both women find jobs. Elizabeth taught at a school for free children's education. Sarah learned sewing and later started her own dressmaking shop. More papers appeared. A marriage record from 1867 showed Sarah married a free man named Thomas, a carpenter. Elizabeth never married but stayed close to Sarah and Thomas, living nearby and often called Aunt Elizabeth in family letters. Rebecca found later photographs. One from 1870 showed Sarah Thomas and their two young daughters in front of their home. Slightly to the side stood Elizabeth, older and grayer, but smiling. The women had created a life together, a family that valued truth over the lies of the past. One question remained. What happened to the original 1863 photograph? How did it survive the war and end up in the Charleston archives? Rebecca found the answer in Jonathan Whitmore's estate papers. When he died in 1889, his studio contents were sold. The negatives and prints went to a collector named James Morrison, who was building a large collector of Civil War photographs. Morrison's collection later went to the Charleston Historical Society in 1931. There, wrongly labeled and filed as Two Ladies of Charleston, the photograph waited almost 90 years for someone to see its real meaning. Rebecca published her research in the Journal of Civil War History in February 2020. The article called Sisterhood Defiant, Kinship, Resistance, and Photography in 1863 Charleston told the full story of Elizabeth and Sarah. The reaction came fast and strong. News stories shared it. The photograph spread quickly online, viewed and shared millions of times with comments of shock, anger at the system that hid their bond, and respect for their bravery. But the real effect came from historians and descendants of other enslaved families. Rebecca got many emails asking, "Could you help me look into my family's story?" The photograph had opened a path, showing people that similar hidden stories might wait in archives everywhere. In the months after the exhibit, the story of Elizabeth and Sarah kept spreading. The Charleston Historical Society started a new project to identify enslaved people in their photo collections, many listed simply as servants or helpers. Rebecca got a research grant to keep finding stories of family ties across racial lines during slavery. She worked with genealogists in descendant communities, helping families rebuild histories that slavery had tried to erase. Margaret became a voice for fair genealogy, speaking at schools and historical groups about putting descendants at the center of research. She partnered with DNA companies to connect African American families with their roots, closing gaps left by poor records. The original 1863 photograph was cleaned up digitally and shared freely online. It appeared in textbooks, films, and museum displays around the country, not only to show slavery's cruelty, but to prove resistance and love could exist too. In June 2021, Margaret got a surprising email from a woman named Caroline, who had seen news about the exhibit. Caroline came from Elizabeth Cousin's line, the same relatives who took the Ashford estate in 1864. "I feel shame for what my ancestors did," Caroline wrote. "They ruined Elizabeth's life out of greed and bias. I cannot fix the past, but I want you to know I respect what Elizabeth and Sarah did. Their courage shows my family's weakness." Margaret and Caroline met in Charleston and walked the streets where Elizabeth and Sarah once lived. They visited the spot where Whitmore's studio had been. They went to the church where Richard Ashford was buried and found Hannah's unmarked grave in the area for enslaved people. Together they arranged a proper headstone. Hannah, 1812 to 1847. Mother of Sarah, beloved. One afternoon, Margaret and Rebecca returned to the Historical Society for the last time. They stood in front of the photograph, looking at the two women whose brave decision had touched so many lives. "What do you think they would say?" Margaret asked quietly. "What do you think they would say?" Margaret asked quietly. "If they knew we are here sharing their story." Rebecca thought about Sarah's journal, Elizabeth's letters, their reunion in Philadelphia, and the life they built together against all odds. "I think," Rebecca said at last, "they would say it was worth it. Every danger, every loss, because the truth lived on. Love lived on." Margaret nodded and gently touched the glass over the photograph. "And we lived on. We are still here, still telling the story. That is their victory. That is their victory." As they left the building, the late afternoon sun made long shadows on Charleston's old streets. Somewhere in those shadows, Rebecca pictured the spirits of two sisters walking side by side, free at last, recognized at last, remembered as they always deserved, not as owner and servant, but as family. The photograph stayed as a quiet witness to their courage, waiting for the next person who would look closely enough to see the truth inside it.